Oh, you did. Thank you.
You see the note, Lindsay? just sent?
Lindsay sent an email saying she's having trouble getting on, incorrect passcode.
Maybe she was using the one from last
Phone
time.
passcode.
All right, you're all set to go.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll call the meeting to order. And Celeste, do we have any public?
Celeste muted.
Yeah,
I think she said no public.
no public? Okay, thank you.
Correct. There's no public. Sorry.
Okay, all right. Okay, I think this is the month where we look at goals. Dick, would you like to read them?
Goal 1, governance. The board will implement a governance model that looks to the future and fosters a high level of effectiveness and efficiency. Goal 2, community engagement. The board will use a proactive approach to community engagement. Goal 3, equity. The board will use their operational definition of equity as an overarching guide in policy development and decision-making. Goal 4, legislative action. The board will keep abreast of legislative issues and take action when needed to support the district.
Thank you. And at this point, any comments on whether we are meeting those or not? Not that we can't comment later on during the meeting too, but if the ship is headed in the wrong direction, it's always good to figure it out early. Alrighty. So the next thing will be.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Sure.
Is the next meeting, we're talking about monitoring, and is part of that, I can't remember, is part of that developing kind of a performance criteria for how we meet such goals? Or is that in the future?
It's definitely in the future. I'm trying to remember whether it's in the work plan for next time. Anybody have the work plan handy?
I didn't add it in, but we had talked about the last meeting, February, I thought was what
Yes.
we decided on.
All right, but it was specifically like we would have a little bit more criteria, some like performance indicators for how we meet those goals, like specifying more. Is that correct?
No, what we were going to do, I believe, was to take a look at the policy book and unpack in more detail some of the policies that we've previously adopted. Specifically, Deb recommended that we take a look first at, and regularly during our meetings, at those policies that we, the board, are supposed to be monitoring.
Yeah, the last packet, I think it was the last packet, included a short memo from Deb on that subject.
Right, and a reading from Val about why we would want to do that. But we can do that all again in February.
Yeah.
But Randy is responsible for the first sets of policies, and then we're responsible for the rest.
Perhaps our thinking was that while the budget wouldn't necessarily take up all of the January meeting, we don't know there are enough things that haven't been set yet by the state. So we probably don't want to agree to take on a bunch of things in January when we might not be able to get to them.
Right.
Okay. The consent agenda, the only item on the consent agenda is the minutes. Dick?
I move the consent agenda.
Okay, moved by Dick Dale. Is there a second? Second by Mark Kaplan. Okay. All in favor, please say aye, or raise your hand, sorry. And anybody opposed, raise your hand. Anybody abstaining, raise your hand. Say the consent agenda passes unanimously then. And the next item would be a decision about whether we're going to take advantage of the new state statute about using Australian ballot in the district annual meeting. And there's a proposed motion on packet page 5.
I would move that.
Okay, moved by Dick. And the wording again is on page 5 for Celeste's benefit. Is there a second?
Alex.
Alex, okay, second by Alex Wild. Is there any discussion?
We already vote by Australian ballot because of the way we set up the Taconic and Green in order to approve the budget and any warrant article. The critical piece in this case, I think, specifically references an Australian ballot related to who the moderator is, who the clerk is, and who the treasurer are. Those could technically, under the way I'm reading the law, be added to the warned articles that are voted on by Australian ballot.
Jim?
Yeah, agree completely with Dick. I'm guessing that we're going to, a lot of boards, actually the select board later, were making the same sort of decision. And a lot of them are kind of noting the fact that they'll intend to have informational meetings online. I just, wanted to double check that's our intent as well.
Yeah, it's required.
Yeah.
So for school districts, you're required to have an informational session. So the folks who served in the roles that Dick just talked about adding to Australian ballot, the folks we elected last year would remain in those positions for the informational session because their term is for a year. So anyway, so that would be we would likely do that on the same day that we are planning on having the floor in-person meeting, unless we made a different decision.
I think one item we already talked about handling in January would be a little bit more planning for how to conduct the discussion part, at least. Anybody else want to speak to the motion?
Herb, this is Jane. I just want to let you know ahead of time, I'm having problems with my camera. So I can hear and see you guys, and I'm just going to be it looks like I can use my hand signals there in order to respond to questions. So just to let you know, I am here but listening.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to speak to the motion? Not seeing anybody then.
John's
Oh, I'm sorry,
got
John.
his hand up.
John, go ahead.
Maybe I'm missing something, but it kind of seems like a layup. Are there any real downsides to any problems this presents? Do the clerks have town clerks have any insight that we've heard of, or any concerns or anything?
Well, the town clerks don't have a role in school district meetings anyway, unless they're also a school district clerk.
No, they have
Australian ballot.
votes
Oh, okay, the ballots themselves, yeah.
and the ballots. And the difficulty is going to be that informational meetings may cause someone to change the wording of a warned article. For example, I could easily hear somebody objecting to some aspect of the budget and proposing a change in wording, because the moderator does the warned articles, and those are basically forwarded on by both the board and by that meeting. There's a vote to forward it on for voting. If any of the warned articles are changed, all of a sudden we have a potential problem. In addition to that, the town meetings have the same problem, because the warnings have to be, I believe, 45 days or 30 days in advance. And the warning of all of those things has to fulfill that. So it's perfectly possible, I think, that the warned articles will have to be warned and the vote will have to take place after the traditional May 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. Anyway, Mark has his hand up.
Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Dick, so is your concern that they'd be tampering with the warning?
No, it's the fact that if somebody wanted to nominate a different moderator, for example, that would be a contested election, but that person would not have been included on the warned education stuff, which would now be included. And so there couldn't be nominations from the floor. Obviously, the legislators got to work out much of these details, but I don't disagree that the Australian ballot is the way to go. And I agree, John, that it is a layup in this particular case, because the only item that we need to specifically do in this education thing is the moderator, clerk, and also, by the way, our salaries. But
There's also an additional one. We apparently need to put on there a vote on approving the date and time of next year's annual meeting.
yes,
So does somebody have a hand up here? I'm looking.
Yeah.
Ben? No,
Yeah.
not Ben.
We got Jim and John.
Okay,
I
Ben.
just, I think from, this is from some discussions at the VSBA. We had a meeting with legislators and stuff like that. And, my understanding was that a lot of people are expecting that for anything on the Australian ballot, we actually lose that old ability to amend items, for vote. So if it's on the Australian ballot, then even if we have an informational meeting in advance, that the expectation is that you're not going to be able to, amend something that's going to be on the Australian ballot. So we're sort of losing that ability to make adjustments from the floor.
Who else wants to speak?
That's my understanding of the expectation anyway.
John, go ahead.
Maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, but I thought in for the informational meeting, it was solely informational, and that can we make amendments to warrant articles during the informational meeting?
no,
No.
Then I'm misunderstanding.
it has to
So
do with,
the answer to your question is it's not strictly informational, but I'm not sure we ever had the ability to change a warrant article at this.
no, if there's a contest for the moderator position.
That's it, right? Though there's nothing. It's only the moderator and the clerk, right?
And the treasurer.
A few other things.
But I think the point is
back to what Jim said. If, for example, during the informational meeting, somebody says, well, I think we ought to be paying the school board members $1,200 instead of $1,000. They have the right to that opinion, but that can't change anything in the warrant article by then.
Yeah. So, okay.
Melanie?
Right, exactly to that point. And that the only option now is you vote something down. There is no amendments. There are no changes. Everything is either you vote for it or against it. And I think maybe that just needs to be brought to the public and made very clear, at the time of, the informational meeting. The only time I think I've ever experienced that is at the town level. So it's typically, I haven't seen it at the school board level.
Okay, anybody else want to speak to the motion, which is to do what's on page 5 of the board packet?
I just want to add to it just because I think it floats in here, and this was a question that was asked for anybody who is up for re-election. Act 162 also waives the requirement for you to collect voter signatures. There's a candidate consent form that needs to be filled out, but you don't need to collect the signatures. So I just and I guess my question, Herb, do you know that email you got from VSBA that included all the documents, Act 162 and 90, whatever the other one was, as well as sort of that summary sheet? Did that go to all board members, do you know, or only board chairs?
I do not know.
Okay. Does that email sound familiar to the rest of you? We'll get that resent out to all of you because it contains some information that I think will be useful to everyone. So Herb, I'll find the email that you shared with me and I'll get that out to board members, okay?
And for those members whose terms would end, who are interested in re-election, I believe the place that you file your consents, or you also used to file your petitions, but now that required is the town clerks, not the school board clerk, correct?
Town clerk.
Yeah.
And just to follow up, I think somebody asked, I've been in contact with with some town clerks. I've got a meeting tomorrow with another one. It's likely that I'll end up meeting with the town clerks representing Taconic and Green to make sure we're coordinated as well. So we'll be partnering with them. Okay.
Okay, any other discussion on the motion? Okay. Jane or Lee, I can't see either of you, so if you have something, I think you just have to unmute yourself and can't see anything here. Okay. All right, all those in favor of the motion, which is to conduct the Taconic and Green Regional School District 2021 annual meeting using Australian ballot voting method for all articles, please raise your hand. Any opposed, please raise your hand. Jane, your thumb is still up, but I'm assuming you're not opposing because it was up before.
Correct. I can't get it to go down. I've got funny things happening. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. There you go. You got it down. All right. That passes unanimously then. And the next item is the draft budget, and particularly for the benefit of our student members, are we planning to start off with the sort of a discussion of the 2 pages of impact before we get into the nitty gritty?
That was the plan.
Okay, so who wants to kick off with that? And that would be the 2 pages that say Taconic and Green Regional School District FY22 budget, December 15th, 2020.
So
ready to go. Okay, so you guys can see that we are showing right now a budget that's mostly flat, 0.2% decrease from FY21. Obviously, we still have lots of things to tweak, and we will continue to make those changes over the next few weeks. But right now, it's looking pretty good. We have 2 main drivers that are keeping that happening. So you're aware that we had reduced some staff this year, and majority of that was done through attrition, a couple classroom teachers, some paraeducators. There's an administrative position, and social emotional that's sort of mixed in there as well. So those reductions sort of automatically, right, we're not putting them back in the budget. So there's a reduction there that we're able to show for FY22. In addition to that, we do have a lower secondary tuition student count. You'll note in here that sort of at the last hour yesterday when I was drafting this up for you guys, we got the call back from Long Trail of their count for 8th grade, which was 12 students, which is a little higher than I think they typically have for us, much higher. And so that count of 12 was not included in the draft presentation that was sent out with the agenda. If we add those 12 kids in, it takes our 0.2% decrease up to a 0.4% increase. And it's a little over a penny on the tax rate. So obviously an impact, not a huge impact because we're working with a big budget. And included in the count is are the additional 15 GHOST students that we typically would include in. We can talk about that a little further when we review the final draft and decide whether or not you guys want to keep that 15 in, whether or not we want to consider lowering that number. We can have a conversation about that when we talk about
because we have some folks on the board who weren't on this time last year. Do you want to just give a little explanation of GHOST students, and then I'm going to call on Jim?
Sure. So we typically have kids moving in and out of the district sort of all year long. And when a student who's in the secondary program moves in, we are paying that full tuition cost for that student. And it's allocated based on the number of days that they might attend. So we don't necessarily know next year exactly how many students we're going to have to pay for. And there's potential for kids to move into the district, and we want to make sure we budget for that potential. And in the past, historically, we have seen additional kids move in. The net impact of kids moving in and kids moving out is an increase in the count.
Thank you. Jim.
Yeah, I was just hoping I guess I'm being a little dense on the Long Trail 8th graders. Is that current 8th graders, which, I think they had some additional students because some parents moved their kids there. Are these existing eighth graders moving into ninth next year?
Exactly. There are current eighth graders attending Long Trail who are in the TNG districts. So when they become ninth graders, we will pay for them.
Okay, do we know what, I'm just guessing that potentially some of those students moved from other schools into Long Trail because of the nature of this year and.
Yeah, I don't know. Celeste and I were talking about that actually when she brought me that number, and I think it's something we should look at. We talked about sort of diving into that a little bit more. Who are these kids? Why didn't we know about them? Are they kids that left our schools and went to Long Trail, maybe 6th, 7th grade? Are they kids that moved in from out of state? And this is the increase that we're seeing, right? That just started attending Long Trail. So we don't have the answer for you for that yet, but we've talked about it and we'll try to get that data for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can tell, this is Jane. My son had just left Long Trail a year before, but I know in talking with folks that are involved with the LTPA there, that it sounds like the enrollment went up fairly significantly from out-of-state folks, but I don't know how much of that is with respect to, the high school.
Thank you. All right. I interrupted Sue when we were talking about ghost students.
Melanie.
Melanie, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I just want to ask a quick question, I guess. Am I to understand that 7th and 8th graders that go to Long Trail are not on our radar at the BRSU necessarily?
So Celeste gets this information from all of the independent schools, sort of grabs their enrollment numbers. I think this year when she grabbed those numbers from all the schools, Long Trail didn't get back to her when she originally asked, and we just missed it before we sent the draft out. Following up with them to say we really need those numbers. So yeah, we do typically stay in communication with the independent schools. This was just sort of one of those last minute things. But for example, there are kids in 8th grade at Maple Street. There are kids in 8th grade who are in home study right now, who we've included in the budget based on, our review of home study and who has been in home study all along and who might have started new home study this year simply because of COVID or perhaps because of COVID. We can make that assumption. So we've thrown those kids in the budget. So we typically do try to grab all of those kids out there that are going to be moving into the secondary program so we don't miss any.
But there's no reporting from the towns and census data that you guys are working with. You're specifically then just working with reported numbers from schools.
Yeah, I mean, the towns wouldn't really have this data, right? These are kids that are enrolled in various schools in our region.
Okay.
Anybody else on that point? Okay, Sue, do you want to?
John has his hand up.
John has his hand up.
I just have a question. I'm not fully understanding. Sue, first of all, did you say the equalized tax rate will go up a cent because of this?
A little over a penny when I add those 12 kids in, yeah.
I guess that's what I'm a little lost on. Is it because there's a reduction, because those things weren't accounted for this year, there's a reduction in the surplus, or is it because next year, I understand the spending, the numerator will go up, but if they're accounted for, wouldn't the denominator, the equalized number of students?
So they're not accounted for, right? So that's the key. These are kids that
next year,
they're not accounted in equalized pupil this year. They will be next year, but this year, which is the number that's half the average to calculate the tax rate, they're not in that number because we're not paying for them this year.
Okay. Is that equalized? Is it still a 2-year average for the equalized students?
It is, yeah.
That why we're paying for it? Because we're essentially, that's only gonna, bring up the, if there's 12 students, we won't fully reflect those 12 students for 2 years. I just got a little trouble understanding why is there, if we're counting these students, why is that, and there's complete spending, why is that not negating each other?
So what it does is when we throw those kids in the budget, it's an increase of $220,000, right? So we'll increase. If we left the budget as is and we just threw those kids in and that was the only change, it would increase the budget by $220,000. It would not do anything else to any of the other numbers in the tax rate calculation because we're not counting the kids this year. They will get counted in ADM next year and be half of that equalized pupil figure when we calculate the FY23 tax rate. But they don't go into play in the FY22 tax rate because equalized pupils for FY22 is a 2-year average of last year's ADM and this year's ADM.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So we'll spend for them next year, but the equalized is based on the ADM of this year and last year.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. That
You're welcome.
I knew that at one point. I just forgot. Over there.
Well, thank you for the question too.
Okay.
Before we
So
proceed, go ahead.
So the other, the only other sort of main thing that's still at play, you know, kids are going to shift and we'll continue to get those counts straight. I haven't made a final decision about how much we're going to include in the budget with respect to a pre-K count. You know, as you all know, pre-K counts down significantly this year for obvious reasons. And I don't know that we can expect that to continue next year. Hopefully it'll be back up because we'll all be back up and running as normally in September, hopefully. But so we'll have to talk about how many kids we really want to include. You know, we know who's out there right now for 3-year-olds that would be moving into 4-year-olds, but we don't really know what that count could have been if we weren't in COVID right now. So I think I'm going to be talking to Randy a little bit more about how, you know, and talking to the private providers about how we can try to do a better estimate for that number for next year. It's not a big impact on the budget, but you can see when you look at the budget summary page that pre-K has a significant decrease, and that's why, because I don't have a lot of kids in that count. And we also thought that extra 10 hours that we were going to pay for the 4-year-olds was going to be a big number this year. And of course, we're not seeing that again, you know, due to COVID. So what is that going to look like for next year? So I still have to tweak that a little bit. We don't have any impact to health insurance decisions due to the new state contract included in this draft yet. Staff are still making their choices. We're sending all that information up to Blue Cross Blue Shield. I need to do that all at once. It's hard to do piecemeal. So it will be presented in the next draft and we'll have the majority of it, you know, will get captured. The only other, let's see, the last big piece that I can think of that's not included in here is special ed assessments. You know, we're not expecting to see an increase in the special ed budget overall. And if ADM, right now, we know your ADM is lower than last year's, which means you get to keep last year's number, right? Because we can't go below that number based on the legislation that was passed last spring. And those are the numbers that feed into the assessments for special education as well. So, you know, I don't think it's likely that even if we see a small increase in the SPED assessment, I don't expect it to be large. I actually anticipate it to go down, but we'll have that for you in the next draft as well. So those are the pieces that we're still working on.
Sue, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Sorry, this is a little awkward. Going back to the comments about the projections with the pre-K and, you know, in the situation with COVID, is that the kind of thing where it might be helpful to ask a question like of the AOE? Like, would they be able to offer any suggestions on how might to consider that projection?
No.
Okay.
Enough said.
Yes, that's that.
Absolutely. Sorry, no.
I think Jim's got a question too.
Jim, is your hand up or are you just thinking?
We'll see you then. Yeah.
He's good. Okay.
Lindsay has a question.
Lindsay,
go ahead.
I just have a quick question because I know that there's a lot of things that have been going on with COVID and stuff like that. So I guess my confusion was I thought that school lunches and meals were provided through the state. So have we seen any reimbursement for that, or is the school district still responsible? It's just the students don't have to pay for the meals?
that's it. So the change in the food service program for this year is that we're operating under the summer food service regs, meaning that it's free for everybody that participates. And what that ultimately means for us in our budgets at the local level is that it's going to cost us a little more to provide food service. And so while we are being reimbursed for all of those meals, our participation obviously is down, right? Which makes sense because there are less students taking meals in schools, but the cost has not changed. And in general, the food service program is locally supported partially, right? It's not covered completely by revenues. There's a share that it's going to be that local share is going to.
Is anybody else occasionally losing Sue's audio?
Yes.
Did we just lose her? Oh, Sue, we've.
All right, I'm back. What was I saying when how much did you hear?
We missed most of it.
Okay, so I'll start over. So the food service program this year, yes, everybody is being paid for by federal funds, but since there's less participation, we're going to get in a lot less revenue. And so the locally supported costs are going to be higher this year in TNG and in Medway, our other school that does, or other district that does provide food services. Does that answer the question?
Sorry. So this is Jane again. I mean, I know you answered the question a moment ago, but I didn't really follow up with asking if it's not, I guess I'm just thinking that I would anticipate that our school district is not unique in having to anticipate how to deal with, some of the numbers in the budget with respect to COVID. And I just was wondering, if not the AOE, is there like another body that would help guide, that would be able to comment about what might be anticipated in affecting those kind of numbers?
So, I mean, really what you're talking about is how many kids are going to be attending our private providers, our preschools that we will have to pay for. And in any normal year, that's a tough thing to call because it's based on, parent decision, people moving in and out of a district. And we can know who's here right now, but we can't necessarily know what decisions are going to be made by those families next year, right? So that's why it's a budget projection. We do the best we can with what we know, similar to the secondary program. It's the same type of thing. But really, I think the best gauge of who's going to attend and how many kids are we going to be asked to pay for are the private providers, because they're the ones on the ground talking to the families and have an understanding of who's out there and who might attend. I think right now, the difficulty is we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. We don't know what school's going to look like in September. We don't know if families are going to feel comfortable sending their kids back to school. I think there's just a few more factors at play. And I wouldn't think that there is anybody who can better project what those numbers might look like than us having conversations with those private providers. But I'm happy to listen to anything else anybody else might have to offer on that.
Does anybody else want to talk about that topic? Not seeing any hands up. Okay. Sue, is there anything about the tax rate that you put on the second page about this that you either want to update or particularly call our attention to?
No, I mean, if everybody else is comfortable with sort of the summary that we have here, I think the only thing that I want to point out on the tax rate is that in this draft, we did go ahead and include this year's anticipated deficit, applied it towards the towards next year's education spending, reduced education spending with that surplus. Did I just say deficit? I'm sorry, my brain is mush right now. You know what I mean, the surplus. And that's going to reduce the tax rate by about 2.7 cents, which is helpful. And I think also, it's important to point out that because the property yield announced by the tax commissioner right now is going down, that automatically increases our tax rate over 3 cents. We also have that sort of automatic 2 cent increase because it's the last year of our incentive. So we're going from a 4 cent decrease in the tax rate to a 2 cent decrease in the tax rate. So there are things that are happening with the tax rate that are not something that we have control over, right? There are things that are going to happen to those numbers regardless. And the fact that we're coming in with a budget that is fairly flat, or we hope to come in with a budget that's fairly flat, is extremely helpful.
And just remind us, the property yield according to legislation is the amount of tax that would be necessary. Go ahead.
Right, that will raise, it's $1 on the tax rate, basically. It's the estimate that the state is saying would produce $1 on the tax rate for everybody. So when we spend more than that, tax rate goes up proportionally based on how much it is over that dollar.
Thank you.
Can I ask the question? Just thinking of our goals and looking forward, lots of things you've mentioned this just now will have an implication next year. Are you worried about what's going to hit us next year? We'll have less of the 2 cents. We may have more kids that we have to pay for who we haven't counted. What else?
I can think of one thing, which is that Mount Tabor and Sunderland no longer are protected by the 5% per year increase.
Right.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to point that out in our annual report, Herb. I think it's really important that your communities understand that this is the last year that you'll receive that protection. And for Sunderland especially, it's going to be a very big jump because they took advantage of the large amount of surplus that they had when we first moved into Act 46. So yeah, it's a really good point, and we need to make sure we sort of pound it into everybody so that the following year people aren't very surprised. I think that one of the things that helps us, Deb, is the tax stabilization reserve, right? We have a big chunk of money there that we have to be careful about using.
Yeah.
And it's there to stabilize the tax rate. We need to understand that there are times where the tax rate is going to go up, and how much are we willing to allow it to go up, and how much do we want to draw from that tax stabilization to support it while we're still thinking about what's going to happen in the future, and how much do we need to set aside and save for that future.
Right.
Ben.
I also want to acknowledge that I think John's had his hand up for a little while. But I sort of like want to I feel like it's really important to state that as Deb was asking about how we think about the future, and recognizing that by trying to hold a flat budget while the cost of living and the cost of doing education goes up means we are effectively providing less service to our children and to our staff than we were before. So that I think it's really important that we're explicit in making statements like that, or showing both sides of the coin. I do applaud the work that's happening to hold a flat budget, and I think we have made some reductions in staff. We've taken advantage of retirements, as we've said, and things like that. But it means we have fewer people in buildings, and as cost of living goes up for folks, we're trying to hold budgets flat, and this is the tough reality of running a business that is paid for by the taxpayers who don't want to see the costs go up, but the reality is costs go up. So at some point there's a breaking point here, and I'm nervous about what's going to happen coming out of COVID as different budget pressures come to bear as we look into the next year, and we do have the end of this protection for 2 of our sending towns. It seems to be setting us up for a whole slew of problems, and I just want to sort of make sure that we keep forefronting our ultimate purpose, which is to provide a great education for our young people, and that we don't sacrifice that in trying to keep the budget numbers low so that to keep the taxpayers happy in that way. Like, we're going to have to, as a communities, we're going to have to grapple with that. So I'm just sort of putting that out there for the record, whatever it is.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. John, and then Mark.
As far as I think we are getting whacked a little bit by the property yield, and that's I think that's a direct result of COVID. And Sue, if I'm not incorrect, that the property yield calculation is the total revenue raised in the education fund from property taxes divided by the total number of students in the state, correct? Is that-
I think there's a little bit more that goes into it. By them assessing what the revenues are going to be in the education fund and then estimating what they're going to need to pay out to all the districts is they're using that information. And I can share with you, John, that I'll ask Celeste to send it out to all the board, the December 1 tax commissioner letter, so you can sort of get an idea of all the different things that they take into consideration.
I think I was just looking at that.
Yeah, one of the things that we were just told that this isn't finalized right until the spring, and so and it does typically change a little bit every year. Typically, it will go up a little at from what the original projection was to what they finalized. This year, apparently, the amount of money that was given to the commissioner's office, I guess, to estimate what is going to be repurposed from CRF and be able to be dropped back into the ed fund the estimate has gone down considerably from what they originally used, which is not putting things in the right direction. It means they're going to have less money to work with, and that yield could end up going up a little bit.
But you anticipated my question there. That was good.
Yeah.
Well, the federal funds, but I think it's also, generally speaking, though, that yield has increased it because we're raising less revenue from property values in part, or that's at least part of it, right? And because, maybe there's more, they're expecting more people with income sensitivity.
Yeah, right. That's part of the formula. Yeah.
Yeah, less property tax revenue is my understanding. And if that property yield stay the same, I think it's important to note, especially, I think you mentioned this before, but any people watching or reporters trying to grapple with this, that if that yield stayed the same as last year, then we would actually have a reduction in the tax rate, all other things unchanged, of $1 to $1.63. I think you said 3 cents before.
It's right now 3.6 cents on it contributes 3.6 cents to that current increase that I've shared with you. What is it? 4.7. So, but to the number before the residential equalize is calculated itself without that 2 cent sort of incentive drop. Yeah, you're right. We would be seeing a decline. And then of course, what would happen on the other end is the state wouldn't raise enough money in the ed fund and they'd be short. So
we can only hope that next year we might see, especially if we've had a lot of people move to Vermont and they're going to become primary residents, as homesteaders, as opposed to non-homestead, that hopefully we'll have a reduction in the property yield with increased property value, property revenues. So that's just a hope that we can bounce back. That property yield could swing backwards and reduce our tax rate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really depends on whether or not they continue to. I believe that this year, they decided that they were not going to, that ed fund deficit, they weren't going to roll that into our yield, right? So that yield is predicted without taking into consideration the huge deficit that they know is out there. And at some point, they're going to have to address that. So I think that's, whether they should do it through the general fund, as they've said, not on the backs of the education fund, but or the education tax, I should say, but who knows what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Mark, go ahead.
While I do agree with Ben about the value of education and, the smaller the budget, the less we can provide. I think this is going to be a very tough year to pass a budget that has an increase. We've been lucky enough every year that I've been on the board to be able to have a budget that passes that always had an increase. But I'm reluctant to see us pass a budget that has a significant increase of, a couple pennies. I think we'll get some pushback from the constituency. I think we got to be careful.
Who else would like to talk about the tax rate? Ben.
One last point. I agree with you, Mark. I think that's the dilemma we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And
And
then we go back to square one.
right. And I guess I would sort of, there's been some work that's been happening at the state level on a sort of a shift in the model of the funding model to go from property tax which is really a blend of property and income tax because of the income sensitivity provisions, but to move fully to an income tax based system. And there are a couple of groups that have been working on that, and a couple of legislators that I know have been entertaining that. So it may be something that that we want to look into as a board, is in terms of just being able to support that or not. Not for tonight's discussion, but I think it does, in many ways it's a much fairer system, and much more transparent, honestly.
Dick.
I wanted to ask a little more philosophic question, which has to do with, Randy, obviously we're not mired in the details. I noticed a substantial increase in the line item for summer school, which I think addresses. My philosophic question is, are we doing with our money the best we can to accomplish, in particular, goals of achieving equity and, to use Ben's words, the best quality education that we possibly can in the constraints of a budget?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. I wanted to have an opportunity to respond to that. I do. Obviously, this is the first time I'm working with you on presenting a budget, and I see my role as being responsible to what you've communicated to me as your priority areas, and to present you with a budget that is fair to taxpayers, right? Considering everything that you've talked about. There's more to this, right? We've got tax stabilization money. It's from my perspective, worth considering whether or not you want to use some of that this year. But you're not going to talk about that tonight. In response to your question, I do want to share with you a few programming considerations that are included in this budget, which includes BRSU, okay? Because that's what's tricky for me to pull those two things out. Yes, there's an increase in summer programming. That is anticipated only for this year. And the number was generated through work with Sue to determine if we wanted to provide summer programming at all of our schools as a way to consider COVID impact for this summer and give some students some educational opportunity over the summer. I wanted to be able to do that. It seemed like, given everything that our students have been through, that it was an investment, a one-time investment that could potentially make a difference for, I'm just going to say students, right? We can disaggregate that and put descriptors in front of that. But yes, summer programming only for this year, and it is in addition to the budget. We've also included money for a supervisory union equity audit. We started equity work this year. I believe that we've focused on our adults and looking at implicit bias and white privilege training across our system. I would like to conduct an audit next year of our overall practices that then we would use to inform our work over the next, 3 to 5 years. So you do have money in there for that, which I think is a worthwhile investment and reflects your priorities. ESSER money, I am working with Sue. If we think back to our last meeting, I was in total agreement that we should anticipate that we are going to have some unique needs in our system related to social emotional needs, regulation. I think that I have this kind of term that's much more placeholder, except, when you have weird placeholders, they just sort of take on a life of their own. But I'm calling it kind of an executive functioning coach, or somebody to help all of us figure out how to get back to school, sustaining 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. I think we're going to have some deficits, and using our ESSER funds to support those needs, I think is important and proactive. I would anticipate that next spring, there's going to be a whole lot in the educational literature about this area and our students returning to school. So that's not reflected in this budget, but it is a priority. And I think it's important that you understand that. Jen Turner's on here too. She and I have been talking over the last few months about Sunderland and reflecting on communication and programming down there. They've been seeing a reduction in numbers. And so I wanted to let you know that she and I have been talking about really trying some innovative, different programming there next year. So it seems like a really perfect spot for us to engage in some different type of programming. And Jen's eager to take the lead on that, has already started talking to her staff. So I wanted to draw your attention. That does not have a budgetary impact, but it is programming. And I think it's aligned with what you've shared with me is important to you. So those are sort of highlights of programming included in the budget that you wouldn't necessarily see or understand if I didn't share it with you. But I want you to know about. I think that it's important to recognize in response to Ben's question about what is it we need to anticipate as we're considering what we want to put before the voters for FY22. It's important to think about that downstream effect, what's coming in future years. And I do think that in addition to the things that have already been talked about, it's important to recognize that we as a system are likely going to see an impact based on Act 173 in the Census Block Grant, that we will see a reduction in funds coming to us for special ed programming. And the weighting study that's been discussed repeatedly, we heard the legislators 2 weeks ago talking about the fact that we can fully expect that the weighting study will likely turn into some sort of legislation. I anticipate that will also hit our community potentially negatively as well. So as we look ahead, we are looking at potentially receiving less money from the state than we have to date. So I think that's important for you to consider also, or to at least be aware of. There's nothing we can do about it, but we should be aware. I don't want you to be surprised that may be a possible outcome.
When does that kick in?
The legislature hasn't even passed it. They're just still discussing it. But you are going to want to, as a board, be on top of the discussions in the legislature around the weighting study. Census block is next July 1 of 2022.
Right, FY23, our next budget.
John, go ahead.
I wonder if it might be, I don't know if this is appropriate for next meeting, but a suggestion. I'm kind of curious to see what select board members might say from our various towns about the municipal rate side of the property tax rates. And just thinking about Mark's comment, would it be worthwhile to hear from those stakeholders say, and I know in Manchester, where I'm from, where I live, that we have local options revenue, and we've seen an increase, in alcohol and meals taxes revenue, I think, and reduction in lodging revenue. But we might be in a better spot as far as our municipal tax rates than other communities, because Manchester can lean on those local option revenues. But I don't know if that's true for other towns in our district. And I wonder if it might be worthwhile at our next meeting, if we were to invite a select board members from various towns, just to tell us about what they expect for as far as their budgeting and the municipal tax rate. But maybe it's not appropriate. I don't know if that's ever been done before, but I might give us a bigger picture about the effective property tax rate for all our community members in different towns. But I also don't want people to forget that we do have, Vermont does have pretty progressive income sensitivity when it comes to tax rates. So that's just a suggestion. I don't know how people feel about that.
Do you want each of us to ask our own select, rather than having them come, each of us could call our select boards and ask them how it looks? And then, you know, gather the information that way?
Herb, can I respond?
Dick?
It won't be really available by our January 5th meeting.
Okay. I was also thinking if it might be worthwhile thinking about community outreach efforts. If, you know, it could be a twofold exercise, you know, asking them what they see as fiscal implications, and also, you know, what do you see as the purpose of school? You know, just a way for us to connect. Again, that might take more time than we have, but a way, because we want to start connecting with those different stakeholders and.
But what about Dick's point?
About you won't know it all. I feel like, I don't know. I know that John O'Keefe has some idea about an inkling about, just reading the Manchester Journal, has some idea what the municipal tax rate might look like. And if all communities, but if that's pretty good for us to know too, if the municipalities don't know what to expect as far as their municipal tax rates.
Any other thoughts on that topic? Not seeing any hands here. Thoughts generally on the tax rate, back to that broader topic. Are we ready? Yes, Melanie.
Only that our community engagement this year is probably super important for going into next year's budget season.
Okay. Anything else before we have the opportunity to look at the budget pages in detail? And I'm sure some of you will correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I've always thought there's a certain amount of tension between policy governance and the way that at least most of the boards view the budget. And so I'll just put in my 2 cents here. I think that it's up to us to be familiar with the budget. And if we don't understand why something is being proposed a certain way, to ask about it. But under policy governance, I don't think that we ought to be directing anybody to change any item unless by some chance it was actually clearly contrary to one of the policy governance policies. So I don't see our role as going in and saying to Randy, I want you to throw in an extra $10,000 on line 48. But if we don't understand why line 48 is the way it is, I think we ought to ask. So digging into, I guess this would be beginning on really packet page 11. Do you want me to ask if there's any comments or questions on each page? How would you like to go about this?
Well, I think I had thought about just pointing out a couple of areas that were specific, sort of either program changes or increases specifically. And you guys have already asked the couple of questions of things that I wanted to point out: food service and the summer school program. You know, things that I might not have noted for you in the summary because they're smaller. There's one other item that I did want to point out, which is under the board section, actually, which is packet page, oh, I think I passed it, 17 maybe? Yeah, packet page 17, under district administration. And you will see an increase there for our communication support, our communication consultant. And Randy did decide to increase that contract this year due to the needs that we had, and we have left that increased contract cost in it for next year. I don't know, Randy, if you want to add anything to that one item.
Sure.
Geez, I froze up again, didn't I?
You did, but that's okay. I think we got the gist. Because of COVID And knowing that we were finding ourselves in a very interesting situation this summer, I increased Bob's time in order to help support communication efforts, because I felt like it was really important this summer. And given it that it was new, it was for me about trying to provide the most support in areas that we needed it during a time of crisis. So we're leaving it in for right now. We'll see where things go. We may not need it or use it as much next year, but for the time being, we're keeping it in for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, for taking over for me there. That was really the last sort of increased piece that I wanted to point out to you guys, other than the other things that we've already discussed. You know, I think I did show you in the summary sort of what we're thinking about for staffing. We haven't nailed down what we might need for paraeducation support next year. We're still working on that, and we'll finalize it. We have added an additional unified arts teacher based on, and that would be for health, based on what our needs are. And our food service program, we had cut a position here, and we are considering adding a position back in next year.
Oops, you're cutting in and out again.
That entire program was sort of put into one T&G form. It's been working really well, but I think we're still working out the kinks because the program is small, and so staffing, because it's small in each individual school, I think it's tough to still work out what our needs are. So we're still playing with that.
Thank you. I think what I'll do is, and I hope this isn't going to take a lot of time, just call out packet page numbers. And if any of you have any questions or comments on any of them, raise your hand and we'll just go through here, starting with packet page 11. So anybody want to be heard on page 11? Page 12. Melanie.
I actually think I just found what I was looking for. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else on page 12? Ben, was that a hand? No. Okay. Back on page 13.
The only question I have is the transfer of reserves, and I think that's a decision that we'll probably have to wait until next month and possibly even into February, as we begin to really take a look at the total impact on tax rates. So the transfer of reserve funds is an issue, and I don't think it's appropriate to resolve that tonight.
I certainly agree with that, but can we actually resolve it as late as February?
So it depends on which transfers you're talking about. The transfers that are shown here right now would be warned articles. And so that would be something that the voters would decide. We would present it on the warning and the voters would decide. And these numbers are based on the projections that were made last year and the year before as to what we think our needs are over the long term. And then I meet with the directors of each program to determine whether or not that's going to be sufficient. And we basically created, those numbers are meant to be stable. You know, they're meant to try to draw enough money over, you know, a 10-year plan to make sure we can have enough to take from when we need to. How many buses do we need to buy? What kind of building repairs do we need? So that's what those numbers are based on. So that we're not, so they don't impact the tax rate and they don't fluctuate things at all. As far as transfers from the tax stabilization reserve, though, that's a different story, Dick, and you're right. We don't have to make a final decision on how much we draw from the reserve. Instead, we can say, you know, we'd really like to see the tax rate land at a 4-cent increase. And however, we don't want to draw more than this much from tax stabilization. And so we can present to the voters what a 4-cent increase would look like. And then when we actually know what the yield is going to be in the spring, we can draw if we need to from tax stabilization.
That okay, Dick?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on page 13? Page 14. $15. 16.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jane.
Thank you. Could someone educate me what the, on line item 98, the vocational tuition, what that entails? And if there's other stakeholders involved in that, or is that just strictly from the district?
So we have students that enroll, high school students that enroll in the tech centers. And there's statute on how much we have to pay with respect to that. So the way it works is the tech centers take account twice a year of the T&G enrolled students. They do this for all districts across the state. And it's a 6-semester average that is calculated each year. So each year, the last 2 semesters drop off, the next 2 semesters get added on, and we calculate a 6-semester average for tech center enrollment. And then we pay the tech center announced tuition for that 6-semester average. So we're never paying for, you know, we have 2 kids enrolled this year and no kids enrolled next year and 5 kids enrolled the year before. We're not paying for those specific students. We're paying for a 6-semester average count. And you can actually see that number on packet page 22, and that's in with all our tuition numbers.
And just a slight follow-up, it's not a big sum, but the prior year allowable tuition charges, which are the next line, is that sort of what happens the same way as when another public high school decides that things cost them either more or less than they thought they were going to? Is that the same general principle?
Yeah, so what happens is, again, this is statute that we report to the state every year on our expenditures. And we also report on our FTE, basically our enrollment each day. So it's attendance that we're actually reporting. And then the state takes those figures, and it's a statutory formula of what it really costs to educate a kid at that school that they attended. And for us, it's T&G, all the T&G schools together. And that number is compared to the announced tuition. And there's a formula of if you're over or under different percentages, you can bill back, or you either bill additional or you take money back. So right now, unfortunately, the agency has been incredibly behind in getting us information as to what the year before's data has been. It's been years out. I have no way of knowing if we will have to pay any prior year tuition right now, rather than put a number in the budget that doesn't have a basis. I've left it at 0 for now. You can see I budgeted for 26, or anticipated, I should say, 26 the year before, and we ended up only paying out 9. It's difficult right now. This used to be, statute. It was cut and dry. You calculated the numbers. They came in when they were due in November. Everything fell apart a couple of years ago, and nothing's on time right now. So we're just doing the best we can with it.
Thank you. Anything else on page 16? Page 17. $18. 19.
Question. I'm sorry. This may be applicable to page 17, and it may not be, but it's about technology. I understand, it's my understanding that part of the federal COVID funds that Vermont is getting is going to be applied to expansion of broadband and internet services. And I'm wondering, Is there any idea yet on like the amount of funds that will be collected for the districts? I can't remember if that had been answered before in past meetings.
I don't know of any money anything that will impact our budget with respect to that.
I don't either. I haven't heard anything about money from that coming to school districts.
I see.
That
Okay.
doesn't mean it's not happening somewhere.
Right.
We sometimes find out things in the most unexpected ways.
Right. I just was curious because I know that in Peru area, there is talk about different people looking at expanding, you know, the internet services and wondering if they're going to be somehow funneling access to those funds to get internet expansion in their areas with respect to how it's linked maybe with school districts. And I had no idea how to answer that, or where to begin looking at that.
At least in Vermont, wouldn't that money probably be going to, I forget what they're called, these sort of local communication districts that are being set up to improve access?
I don't know. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, back to page 20. Anything there? Ben.
Can I actually just jump back to page 19? And this is not really a line item question, but it's just looking at costs extended around fossil fuel use, and knowing that we've got a lot going on in the legislature right now around basically shifting off of fossil fuels and towards renewables, and that part of that initiative is around municipal use, and a lot of it is also focused around transportation, and that there are some conversations out there around transitioning our vehicle fleet to electric, and the move to electric buses is a huge expense right now. The cost is just outrageous, but it's coming. And it's going to be in law, and this is something that we're going to need to anticipate. And one of the things that's, I just sort of bringing this up. This is sort of like a future item, but like it's a substantial cost to us looking at fossil fuel use and buses, and conversation around how do we sort of collaborate with other community uses around buses and public transportation. And if there's something, as we start to anticipate that and think about that in our budgeting, are there some conversations that we can get into around that with our surrounding districts? And then likewise, focusing around fossil fuel use, are there opportunities to partner with perhaps with private investors around community solar projects for electricity and heat pump, electric-based heating, cooling systems? The cost of initial investment on those large solar arrays is quite substantial, but it's a really sound investment from a financial perspective, and we there may be people in this area who'd be interested in doing that. Certainly, we do live in an area that has a tradition of really extensive giving to education, as BBA is evidenced. And that just may be something for us to consider as a way to long-term think about reducing these costs on this page, and then also our fossil fuel use. So food for thought, perhaps.
There was a time, was it maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when at least one solar developer was making deals with schools to, I forget whether it was to have solar on their own property, but basically to involve the schools in increasing solar capacity. I don't know whether anybody wants to add anything about that.
Yeah, I can tell you, I remember they came to us and it was that they wanted to build large solar fields and have the schools basically sign contracts to purchase electricity from those fields.
So you guys currently have a contract. We all of our schools participate in our solar contract. So we have 2 different solar contracts. One is at Dorset, where they actually do have panels on the roof. And then the second one is, as you said, this is a field project, and that is for all the other schools' electricity take part in that. If I remember correctly, it's a 5%. We get 5% back off that, but it could be 7. I'm not remembering exactly, but I can share that with you guys next time around. So we have a contract already that we're locked into for a period of time for solar. So we are taking advantage of that. You brought up a couple of other points, great points, Ben, and we've had the conversation about electric vehicles. I'm really interested in what you know about when you say it's coming. Like what does that mean? What are we talking about for timing? So maybe you and I can talk about that at another time of what you're really thinking. Greg and I have had this conversation before about electric buses, and one of his biggest concerns is right now what's out there. They're not capable of. They don't have enough power. They're not capable of doing what our buses need to do when you think about going up and down all the mountains that they have to go up and down. At least that's my understanding from the last conversation we had about this, a year or so ago. And that it wasn't something that Greg felt we were ready to enter into. So it'll be interesting if we're going to have to start thinking about that, what that phase-in might look like. And I know that Greg was connected with somebody local to talk about heat pumps specifically. And he definitely had some concerns about whether or not that would work in many of our buildings, whether or not it's something we could use. But I know that he's got it on his radar totally. And I think, unfortunately, with everything that we're all dealing with right now, this year isn't the year to be making any big plans, but it's certainly something that he's got on his radar. Did I miss anything?
Thank you, Sue. John, I think, is next.
Sure.
I was going to change the topic, so I'm going to wait till anyone has a.
I would just say, just to reference, it's the Global Warming Solutions Act is going to be the key driver of this, which does put a liability on the state for enforcing its climate mandate, and so that's the timeline of that legislation is going to be what drives the transition in our fleet.
And I just wanted to comment that I'm not sure what the status is, but I think it was just like 2 years ago that the governor had identified the plan to take monies and specifically create a plan to where the electric stations would be positioned all throughout Vermont so that you could drive from one end of Vermont to the other. And I don't know what the capacity is as of yet, but I would think it would be important to, like with respect to buses and the electric stations, knowing what the status of that plan and somehow, being a part of that conversation with the stations that the governor's plan was creating.
Anybody else on the topic that Ben brought up? Okay, back to John then.
I have a two-part question. First is, where, I think this is in multiple line items, but mental health support spending, where do we see that? Which line items do we see that reflected in? Whether that's contracting out to mental health, counselors, or to in-house.
Let me find it for you, John. Give me a sec. You're going to go to packet page 15. And under the top section there, social emotional student support. So that is a combination of that entire section is a combination of our guidance counselors out in our schools, whether they're hired by T&G or hired by the BRSU and shared out. And additionally, your contracted services for mental health is going to be there. We also have this would also be in the shared services position, a clinician who's employed by the BRSU, and the majority of her time is spent on mental health in a school, and that is also going to be in that shared position. So that section is where you're going to see all that.
Okay, and so it looks like we have primarily budgeted reductions in those areas, correct? From reading.
Yes, so the reductions that you're seeing are not reductions in staffing. They're reductions due to changes in staffing.
Okay, so maybe this is a question for the superintendent. But is there, for my money and my tax dollars, mental health might be super important right now. Mental health support services. And I guess my question for you, Randy, is that if you had your druthers and the money, additional funds, would there be additional services that you would like to offer next year, given that we're coming out of a worldwide trauma?
Yes, and I included them in ESSER. So when I talked earlier about listening to the conversation on what we had on December 1st and the concerns around the social emotional well-being, and that's not in here, but so I didn't add it to the local budget, but it's ESSER funds to support another social worker. So if we've got a fairly decent number of folks. We've got, I could go kind of building by building, but we have a fairly robust support system compared to a lot of other places. And then I was going to add another person in for next year.
So I guess the crux of my question is, do you feel like you've budgeted enough here to provide the resources, sufficient resources?
I do.
Okay, thank you.
The other piece I would add is that the BRSU budget does address part of the concern, because the BRSU has now got a piece that's been shifted from the Taconic and Green to the BRSU, so that all 6 of the schools can share in some of that support. And so it's kind of buried in the BRSU stuff. And Randy did address that when the BRSU met, and we all thought it was particularly important.
Speaking of BRSU stuff, I wonder whether in the annual report, it might be good to have a little explanation of the difference between shared positions with the BRSU and positions for which the BRSU charges each district an assessment.
Sure. So we do a nice explanation, a whole page of the BRSU assessments and sort of how they're calculated, what they mean, why we calculate them that way, how they're shared out to the districts. And I've sort of revamped the summary page of the BRSU budget to try to make that even clearer, what we assess and what we bill. So that would be a great lead into that page. So yeah, we'll definitely include that, Herb. Good suggestion.
Something I just wanted to add, I think in response to John's question, and also kudos to Randy on this. I think from a mental health perspective and also public health perspective, I think what Randy did with expanding the budget and hiring more nurses, that also really speaks to how you provide that baseline care with mental health, because a nurse can really do some initial assessment and referrals and so forth, and that's less expensive than hiring like a single master's level prepared person. And that's not to take away from the social worker that that you're talking about, but I think that Randy is adding to the mental health needs in my perspective. So I think that was great that she did that.
Thank you.
Just to, I guess, sort of give you a context, at our 6 schools, this is just quickly adding up in my mind. We have approximately 11 positions, and then an additional social worker, which would be 12, and then 6 nurses, to Jane's point. So that's a fairly sizable number of staff dedicated to supporting social and emotional needs of kids, given our size.
Any other comments on social and emotional support before we go back to page by page? Seeing none then. Any comments or questions on packet page 19? '20. Comments or questions on page 21?
Alex has a question.
Alex.
I was just wondering, could you explain the change in the food budget?
Yeah, so I'm just taking a quick look at it. I think that's going to be basically due to right now what we're showing is group medical expense due to a change in staffing, right? So you've got a big jump in that line item just based on, you know, as we have changes in staffing, we're going to make predictions on what their medical costs might be. In addition to that, we had reduced a position this year, but we added that position back in for next year. So that's sort of a budget to budget. But when you look at the anticipated numbers, you can see that they're down for staffing because that position is not there, but we are including it in next year's budget. So that the biggest increase, the biggest driver there is going to be that those benefits.
Alex, were you also talking about the decrease in line 630?
Yeah, given the fact that everybody, or well, not everybody, but many students have been relying on school lunch programs and stuff like that, even when they're not going to school, seeing the almost 50% reduction, and just not
right. So it's not really a reduction in food costs itself, though. There's two food lines there, and so there's two food lines in the budget because we have basically what we're showing is this is how much we believe is going to be federally covered, right, through what we can, not only federally, but what we can collect through revenues for what we charge for families and what we get from the feds and the state. And then below that, we're showing this is how much the taxpayers are supporting. So it's broken out that way so that the taxpayers can sort of clearly see what the costs are in the program. And that food number is going to shift depending upon what the other numbers are. So in the FY21 budget, we anticipated we'd be able to cover about $60,000 of food costs because of the amount of revenues that we were gonna receive. That's actually not playing out that way this year. So all the food is covered locally. And then in the FY22 budget, because our staffing costs are increasing, we'll cover less in food, but that same amount of food is sort of down below under the locally supported part.
Okay, yeah, I did see that, but I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions on page 21? Page 22. Page 23, which is different from the other ones. Just a tabulation, basically. Page 24. Okay. Any miscellaneous comments or questions about the budget? While you're thinking, for those of you who weren't on before we actually called the meeting to order, Jim Selskiver said he was going to have to leave early because he has a conflicting Dorset Select Board meeting, and Samantha Stevenson asked me before the meeting whether it might make sense for her to step out once we got into the nitty gritty of the budget. And I said, yeah, I didn't think that she was really responsible for presenting that to the community the way the rest of us were. So that's why she left after a while. And Lexi Lacoste emailed me saying that something had come up at the last minute, which is why we didn't see her here. Okay, having totally gotten off the subject, anything else about the budget? I don't see anything here.
I just want to say thank you to Sue. Is there any detail that you don't know? You're amazing.
Oh, thank you, Deb.
But as to paraphrase Rumsfeld from long ago, do we know what we don't know?
Well, I don't know, but I'm going to take a moment in the spirit of that and just let all of you know that not only does she do a phenomenal, I know she's shaking her head, sorry. Not only did she do a phenomenal job with the budget, but she also does it on her birthday.
Oh,
So she spent her birthday evening here with us, and I thought you would all want to join me in wishing her happy birthday.
Happy
Thank you.
birthday.
Yeah. Happy birthday, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you for the good conversation and the great questions as always, guys, and giving me all this time. I appreciate it.
okay, regarding the budget, there's nothing that we need to vote on tonight, correct? We don't vote until January.
Correct.
Are there future agenda items?
John's got his hand up.
John?
Sorry, I had to put my hat on. I'm in my classroom and I'm freezing. And I also think that the next bridge we make in one of our towns should be called the Sue Wilborn Bridge. We'll just, again, great work from you and thank you. But for future agenda, I don't know if it's next month or in coming months or, but wondering if we should explore possibilities for us to develop mechanisms to leverage private donations and giving. I think there's a lot of people, well, I know there's some people in this community who like don't know how, I had someone approach me like, how do I give to MEMS? And it's funny that a lot of people don't know that they can make tax deductible donations to schools. And I'm wondering if we can start to leverage and create some mechanisms of private giving that will help us to provide the programming that maybe we otherwise couldn't provide, or to stabilize, and also in doing so, stabilize our tax rate from year to year. So that's just something I personally would like to explore and think about.
Okay. That reminds me of something that I guess needs to go on a future agenda. In Danby and Mount Tabor, there has been a long-running dispute, I guess that's a polite way to call it, about whether certain money from the trust set up by Silas Griffith and his wife are supposed to go to, it would now be to the Taconic and Green. And I guess at some point we should update on that and see whether the towns are actually transferring the money the way that at least some of us think they were supposed to. I wonder whether other towns have similar are recipients from other trusts and whether that's being bird dogged.
Well, I think Manchester had MEMS, I don't know if it's in the Friends Foundation that was created right after Act 60. And it's still in legal existence, I think, but it's kind of hasn't really done much in recent years. And I think there's still some money in the coffers, but I don't know.
I mean, over the years, we have tapped into that, the school has made requests of Friends for very specific programming, and they have supported specific requests by the principals. It's definitely not our money. If there is money remaining, I can't imagine that they wouldn't still entertain requests.
That's a little different from the Danby Mount Tabor situation, where at least my position was it was our money because the trust said, here's where it's supposed to go.
Right. Right. And Herb, I mean, that in your investigation of that, you can assure both Danby and Mount Tabor, if they need that assurance that those funds would go to support, specific things at Courier, because that was their original intention. Even though the funds come into T&G, we take in a lot of money with respect to grants and donations, and that's our special revenue funds, and those funds are isolated by school for principal oversight, depending upon the restriction that comes in with it. So, we're perfectly capable of isolating the money to go where the donor has asked it to go.
Thank you. Any other future agenda items? Ben? Yeah, Ben.
This is just another, I feel like I've got a lot of food for thought things today, but I had a conversation with Lori Kleiland, who's the board chair of the Winooski School District recently, and talking with her about a few different things that they're working on up in Winooski. And one of the things she mentioned about, I was asking her what, how they've had such an effective community engagement process and what's they're grappling with right now. There was a student-led initiative and a set of demands around anti-racism that was brought to the school board this summer. And the school board's been working actively with the community to address those demands. And they're sort of using a restorative practices base practice with an outside facilitator and youth co-facilitated process. And it just sounds fascinating, doing some really interesting work. And one of the things that she mentioned that they just do as a matter of practice is that they set aside a full hour of their regular board meetings for community engagement, and do it in a structured way, sort of roundtable conversations or facilitated on a specific topic or whatever it might be. And I said, yeah, we're still in the sort of mode of 10 minutes at the beginning and 10 minutes at the end. And, she's like, yeah, that's not going to do it. And that's been my sort of feeling and frustration, is that it's not worth it for the public to join for these little bits of conversation. It can be if they've got a pressing, burning issue, but in terms of just engaging with the board and like digging into topics that are of interest, we might have a lot more. We might do a lot better. We might have a lot more engagement if we picked certain meetings to have longer, structured dialogue with community around certain topics, and then invited people, at least when we don't have something that the public is bringing to us, that we intentionally invite folks to come join. And could really be sort of powerful in terms of us as a board getting feedback from the public and understanding what their is, and then building that relationship is obviously a very two-way street. So we chatted for an hour about a lot of different things, and that was just one sort of nugget of that conversation that stuck with me. I thought I'd bring to the board, and maybe it's something we can investigate. Again, like we're in the midst of a crazy time, but they've been doing that all through the fall, and it's a really important part of their process and their community relationships. And that all started, so they built the framework for that with a grant that they got through the Nellie Mae Foundation when they transitioned to proficiencies a number of years ago. So that they learned how to do that and built relationship through that process. So there's a bunch of pieces to it, but I just sort of bring that to the board for something to consider for us, especially as we're saying community engagement is going to be really important for us in the coming years.
Any other future agenda items?
Can I just, Ben, who did you say, or what did you say the responsibility of that board was that has been engaging in that? Did you say it was a board, or I'm sorry, I don't remember what you said it was.
Yes, this is the Winooski School Board, Winooski School District School Board. And Tori Cleland is the chair.
Thank
so
you.
I think she's spoken. I don't know who they were. I think Deb, you mentioned. I think you spoke with them when we transitioned to policy governance. But
yeah, they were one of the first policy governance boards, if not the first.
Yeah. So and they've now been at it for a number of years. So they may be a lot more efficient in their meetings than we are in terms of what we have to cover in terms of policy. But I thought that was interesting that they're using the same model, and they're still blocking out these big chunks of time that haven't been able to do.
Anybody else on future agenda items? Bearing in mind that at some point hypothermia is going to set in on John Wilson.
I just want to say I agree with Ben, and I would love to see maybe whether it's having different stakeholder group represented every meeting, different meeting. I think that having building in more community engagement within the meeting could be really interesting and fruitful.
Any other future agenda items? Okay. Celeste, do we have any public?
No.
Okay. And any reflections on the goals that Dick read when we began the meeting? Seems to me we're on track with them, but if we aren't, now's the time to say so.
Well, we did a little more looking into the future than we usually do. So that's good.
Okay. Well, our next meeting is January 5th. Remember, that is when we will be voting on the budget. And I assume that Bob is probably going to try to get another article into the paper highlighting that. It was a good article so far. And I'm surprised that Dick hasn't already made the next motion.
Move for adjournment.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Deb, I believe. Okay. All those in favor of adjourning, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed? Raise your hand. Anybody abstaining? Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.